Collective security comes out of this as well. Things we did not do. We did not join the League after the First World War, the League of Nations. We joined the League after the Second World War, or the equivalent thing being NATO. One of the best examples you see of a successful coalition for collective security, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. If you look at my maps up here, you can see that the North Atlantic Treaty Nations, they're not quite colored in or colored out, but let's see. Yes, you do see them down here. North Atlantic Treaty Organization would be these nations that are in green. Turkey is later going to join, but you've got Canada, the United States, and also Europe. The idea being of collective security, an attack against one is an attack against all. So the premise is, if the Russians decide to send their armored divisions smashing into Germany, you'll have the United States, by extension, drawn into this war. So it's a deterrent. It's designed to say, don't do it because up front you know we have this binding alliance. We see a similar mutual defense agreement in the South Pacific, the APUSH Pact, made up of Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And then SEATO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, you also see the same thing in the old French Indochina regions, which will become Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, some of those areas as well, starting to sort of try to put this containment policy into place. The Soviets, of course, engage in their own sort of formal alliance against NATO, the so-called Warsaw Pact of 1955, which are all the satellite states of Eastern Europe. This will be largely a fixed sort of definitive borderline, flashed without violence, but a key element of where the Cold War is for about the next 50 years. The last thing we want to look at in these lectures would be China policy and the communist monolith. And to discuss that, I wanted to define the term monolith for you. Monolith is the notion of a monolith is anything that's sort of uniform, undefined, faceless, as all one chunk. In the post-1945 era, the United States saw communism in monolithic terms, as did all the Allies initially. And by monolithic, I mean they see communism as this uniform, faceless, conspiratorial, worldwide movement with all communists all around the world sharing the same playbook, the same desires, the same plans, and all taking their orders from Moscow, was the famous phrase. We're taking our orders from Moscow. So as such, any communist threat anywhere was seen as being something that Stalin and the Soviets in Russia had directed. Into this context, you have the Chinese Civil War. There had been a civil war playing in China since before the Japanese invasions of the 1930s between the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Mao Zedong. This war was sort of temporarily put aside during World War II because, once again, coalition warfare, alliances having things in common. The Japanese were a greater threat to Chinese survival as a nation state. With the end of the war, these two sides go back to dealing with one another, and China falls into civil war in the 4 or 5 years after World War II. By 1949, the communists win. And with their victory, the nationalists flee the mainland to the island of Formosa, which you know today by its name of Taiwan. This is the rump of the old nationalist, non-communist government that used to run all of China. By the way, the current Chinese government would really like to have that back. That's an issue you see in current foreign politics today. So, the United States does not even open up relationships with Red China until the 1970s. We do not recognize their government. We recognize the government on Taiwan as the legitimate government of China, and we're going to try to protect and defend that government, once again, as part of this containment struggle. The nationalists were utterly corrupt and incompetent, and no amount of money and aid on our side would have given them victory. Nevertheless, this plays into American domestic politics because the Truman administration is accused by the Republicans of losing China, of being soft on communism. And the key element is China was never ours to lose, but in many ways this is going to explain what you'll see on our next slide dealing with the Korean conflict. To explain some things in Korea. At the end of the war, at the end of World War II, Korea, along with not all, but an awful lot of China and Southeast Asia, had been occupied by the Japanese. Like what happened in Europe in the post-World War II era, this had to sort of be divided up for administrative purposes simply to return it to its original sovereign status. The Allies divided Korea along the 38th parallel, not as a permanent border, but merely as a convenient dividing point set during World War II as occupation regions were being drawn up by the Allies at the Yalta conferences and Potsdam conferences. But like East and West Germany, it winds up turning permanent in this post-war bipolar climate, as both the US and Soviet Union established influence on the peninsula. In Europe, you had East and West Germany. In the Far East, you have North and South Korea. Japan, by the way, will be occupied almost exclusively by the United States. The United States will exclusively supervise that period of occupation and rebuilding, if you will. So this is that'll be very different than the German experience in many ways. In June of 1950, Kim Il-sung, who is the North Korean dictator, he invades the South, smashes across the 38th parallel. Stalin probably knew what he was doing in all likelihood. Stalin probably didn't approve of him doing it, but he probably knew what was going on. Both Stalin and Kim Il-sung figured the West would not respond. But think of the lessons we've learned from history. What lessons did the Allies think they learned from the 1930s? Appeasement. If you give the bully a little bit, the bully will take it all. So totalitarianism, this time it's not Nazism or fascism, but it's communism, seems to be on the march, and doing nothing seems to not be the answer. So President Truman mobilizes the United States Far Eastern Command under Douglas MacArthur, and later placed under United Nations authority. MacArthur wages a defensive struggle to try to maintain South Korea. The war initially goes quite badly for the United Nations, the UN forces, which are almost overwhelmingly American forces, and they get wedged down into this tiny little spot here. Ultimately, they get pushed down, the city of Pusan being the key port at the end, the so-called Pusan perimeter. This is as far as the communists get. MacArthur, for his part, invades behind the North Korean lines at Incheon, strikes a major success there in an invasion, slicing the forces off, grinding them up in the middle, and pushes his way back up the peninsula. At this point, once he gets to here, MacArthur has a critical decision he has to face. Do you simply get back to status quo, or do you continue and bring the war to North Korea? MacArthur goes beyond the 38th parallel and moves forward northward into North Korea, keeps going. Convinced the North Koreans will not respond, nor will the Chinese. MacArthur wants to finish this. And he tells Truman, in his view, the Chinese are bluffing, they won't come into the war. The green lines up here represents how far north the farthest U.S. forces get by October of 1950 into North Korea. As they get closer to the border with China, this bright pink line is the Yalu River, that's the border between China and North Korea. As they get closer, China starts making ominous rumblings through the diplomatic community saying the Americans need to stop, the UN really needs to stop this, don't come any further. But remember, the United States did not recognize Red China, did not have formal diplomatic relations with them, so we don't have a direct line of dialogue with them. In any event, the U.S. government, based on MacArthur's intelligence assessments, thinks that the Chinese are bluffing. Well, in October of 1950, Chinese volunteers, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteers, aka the entire Chinese Red Army, begins pouring down the peninsula against the UN forces and batter rams them back halfway down the peninsula. Ultimately, the battle line stabilizes by June of 51, somewhere around roughly the 38th parallel. MacArthur, at this point, urges the use of atomic weaponry. He says that we need to end this war. His famous line is, there is no substitute for victory. And he says 20 to 30 nuclear weapons ought to do it. And we'll get rid of the Chinese, we'll solve the problem, and North Korea will be gotten rid of too, and this area will be free. President Truman was in no hurry to do this. He says, well, we want to keep this as a limited war. We don't want to engage with nuclear weapons. We don't want to escalate and bring in the Russians. We don't want to have the possibility of all sorts of nuclear retaliation. And MacArthur, for his part, rejects this as bad advice and goes over the chain of command, outside his commander-in-chief, and appeals to the American public for what he thinks the decisions ought to be on the war. In other words, the general is turning into the policymaker. At this point, Truman creates a sensation, a huge controversy, by relieving or firing Douglas MacArthur, five-star commander from World War II, big war hero, and the commanding general in Korea. So this causes a huge controversy. MacArthur becomes a hero and a martyr to the anti-communist right, who say that Truman's just not given the tools to do the job. But the war ultimately becomes a stalemate, that neither side can lose, but neither side can win. In 1953, a truce is signed. That truce is still in effect today. Not a peace treaty, but a truce. In a legal sense, North and South Korea, even today, technically, are still at war. They're simply choosing not to fight. This is the last remaining hot spot of a Cold War that no longer exists. It's the last remaining flashpoint of that war in many ways. But Korea does have some legacies that pan out beyond it. First of all, containment is achieved. It's paid for in blood. 54,000 American soldiers are killed in this 3-year struggle. Secondly, the United Nations is validated. It doesn't fold up and collapse like the League of Nations did in the 1930s against fascist aggression. Third of all, the presidential chain of command, constitutional chain of authority is reaffirmed. The president is commander-in-chief. He does have the authority. Generals are not policymakers. They follow the orders of their civilian commander-in-chief. So civilian control of the military is reaffirmed. And the dogma of the monolith is set as basically American foreign policy gospel, that all communists are the same. And that's going to be a problem a little further down the road in different lessons. And it's going to lead the Eisenhower administration to say that these long conventional limited wars could wind up turning into unlimited wars, which is bad. It's going to lead them to rethink how they want to pursue their foreign policy and move towards a policy of massive retaliation. We don't want to have these armed troops that could go anywhere and fight these limited wars. We want to move towards a policy that's more cost effective. Nuclear weapons are going to be that policy. But that'll get us into our different segment on foreign policy in the post-Origins era, as the Cold War starts to become the norm, as it was for your parents and your grandparents. It was the normal state of being in foreign policy. We'll talk about that as the norm in some different lessons after we discuss 1950s America.